When someone asks you a question and the room goes quiet, there's an expectation that you will answer now, and it will be relevant. And most of the time, that is what happens. But sometimes there is nothing. No clear thought, no usable words, not even a vague starting point. Just silence where something should be. When this happens to people and their mind can't come up with the goods, they take it personally. They decide it means something about them, that they're not quick enough, not articulate enough, or not as capable as other people. What I want to talk about today is why that conclusion is almost always wrong. Because a blank mind is not one single problem. It's a label people use for several different experiences that feel identical. And if you don't know which one is actually happening, you end up drawing the wrong conclusion about yourself every time. Hi, I'm Helen Innes, and I help women stop holding back and start speaking up. This video is part of my series, Why You Hold Yourself Back from Speaking, where I explore the real reasons women struggle to say what they think, what they feel, and what they know. Sometimes the mind appears blank because there was no thought formed there in the first place. You might have been listening, absorbing, following what was being said, taking information in rather than preparing a response. Then, without warning, someone turns to you and asks what you think or what are you going to do about it? And in that moment, the problem is not something has been lost. The problem is that the response is being demanded before one has actually been formed. There is a real difference between not being able to access a thought and not having created one. If you're in a receiving state rather than a generating one, being asked to speak immediately can feel like blankness because the expectation arrived before the thought. Sometimes when your mind goes blank, thoughts do exist, but they're not yet ready to be spoken. You might have reactions, impressions, or a growing sense of what you think, but none of it has become clear enough yet to say out loud. Thinking happens in fragments, half-formed connections, ideas that become clear only when you think them through thoroughly. If you're asked to speak while the process is still incomplete, what you have is simply not sayable. This is often where that feeling of stupidity comes in. You assume that if you cannot express the thought, you must not really understand it. But the thinking may be happening, but it's not yet finished. There is a version of your mind going blank where you know what you think at a high level, you know the conclusion, but you can't cognitively trace how you got there. You might know that something feels wrong, or that you disagree, or that a certain idea does not sit right with you. What you do not have, at least not in that moment, is the verbal structure to justify that knowing. This matters because intuitive recognition and verbal explanation are genuinely different things. You can sense that something is off before you can explain exactly why. When pressure is added and an immediate explanation is demanded, that gap becomes visible. You know there is something there, but you can't convert it into language quickly enough to satisfy the moment. That feels like blankness. Many people experience a blank mind during a presentation or interview or on camera or even on stage. You know what you want to say, you may have practiced, you may know your lines word for word, and then the moment arrives and when you need to perform, you forget everything. When that happens, the issue is retrieval. The information is still there, but access to it becomes disrupted under pressure. That is why people can often remember everything afterwards and feel bewildered that they could not remember it when it mattered. The words did not cease to exist, but your access to them was cut off. Sometimes blankness in your mind happens when you're asked to come up with something on the spot. This can even be low stakes, like when someone says, "What did you get for Christmas?" or "What do you want for dinner?" and your mind offers nothing. Or it can be high stakes, such as a job interview where they ask, "Can you tell me a time when you've handled a difficult situation?" And you can't think of a single example, despite having had plenty of experience in that area. In both cases, the problem is due to the pressure of having to search for and organize information immediately. The answer may exist, but being called to answer on the spot makes you freeze and access to the information gets cut off. This even happened to me with ChatGPT. I wanted to practice speaking, so it gave me a topic I was familiar with, and I literally could not think of anything. There was no human listening, no judgment, and yet I still felt the pressure and my mind went blank. Let's now take a look at the conditions that make it more likely your mind will go blank. The first condition is immediacy. You might think perfectly clearly if given even a little time, but the expectation to respond now can be enough to shut the process down before it started. The second is evaluation, when it stops feeling like an invitation to share a thought and starts feeling like a test. Proof of whether you know what you're doing, whether you're paying attention, or whether you're competent enough. Authority makes this worse. When the person asking has status or power, the perceived cost of not responding well increases, and that increases the pressure. Overload plays a role here too. If there are too many moving parts, too much information, or too many threads to hold at once, the mind can fail to organize it into something coherent in time. In that case, blankness is not the absence of thought, it's the collapse of too many unfinished processes happening at the same time. And then there is self-monitoring. Once your attention shifts away from the subject and onto yourself, you are no longer only trying to think. You're also trying to think about the fact that you're not thinking well enough. You are noticing the silence, wondering what the other person is making of it, and trying to manage the social meaning of the moment. That split in attention can be enough to destroy whatever fragile thinking was taking shape. One of the most telling parts of the blank mind experience is what happens once the moment has passed. Once the pressure drops and the room is quiet again, the mind starts working normally. The words that were nowhere to be found suddenly appear, and that contrast tends to produce a familiar and painful conclusion. You had the answer all along and simply failed to deliver it. A more accurate reading is this: your ability to think changed under specific conditions. When immediacy, evaluation, authority, overload, and self-monitoring are removed, access returns. What looked like incapability was, in most cases, context dependent. Your mind did not fail you. The conditions made access to it temporarily unavailable. That is a very different thing from not being capable. Understanding this changes what the experience actually means. If you treat your mind going blank as one thing, as proof that you cannot think on the spot, you end up drawing a conclusion about yourself that the evidence doesn't support. Having a blank mind should not be understood as a defect. It is a cluster of different experiences, each with different causes, all producing the same outward result. When you think like this, it moves the problem from "I'm not capable" to "my access to what I know changes depending on what the moment demands of me." And once you can see it that way, a small but practical adjustment becomes possible. If the problem is that a thought has not yet formed, has not yet been put into words, or cannot be retrieved under pressure, then creating a little space before answering can make a real difference. That might be as simple as pausing, asking for a second, asking for clarification, or following up later once the thought has had time to settle. The point isn't to answer quickly so you look confident. It's to recognize that thinking doesn't always happen instantly, and that needing a moment doesn't mean you don't know what you're talking about. This is exactly the kind of pattern I work on with clients, understanding what is actually happening beneath the surface so that it stops meaning what you've probably been making it mean. In the next video in this series, I'm going to look at another pattern that can make speaking up harder than it needs to be, over-explaining, and how what you want to say can get buried under too many words. If that sounds familiar, I'll see you there.